Hollywood loves a clean transformation before and after struggle and triumph a perfect reveal. But what if that story is a lie? For many transgender lives, being seen isn't freedom, it's exposure. Careers collapse overnight, privacy is stripped away, and identities become public debate. This isn't a story about becoming who you are. It's about the price you pay when the world refuses to look away, and what's left when everything private is gone. Patricio Manuel. Patricio Manuel didn't walk into boxing to make history. He walked in because it was the only place where effort spoke louder than explanation. Long before the world had language for who he was, Manuel was already fighting quietly inside gyms that measured worth in sweat, not identity. He trained in silence, transitioned in private, and built his body with discipline while the world looked the other way. For a while, that invisibility protected him. He wasn't a headline, he was just a fighter. Then came the moment everything changed. In 2018, Patricio Manuel stepped into the ring as the first openly transgender man to compete professionally in the United States. The victory should have been simple. It wasn't. Instead of celebration, there was hesitation. Opponents pulled out. Promoters stalled. What should have been a career became a question people argued over. His existence turned into a debate about legitimacy, fairness, and boundaries no one had bothered to define before he arrived. Manuel kept showing up anyway, even when fights disappeared, even when losses were magnified and wins were minimized. He refused to disappear just because the system didn't know where to place him. His story isn't about triumph or defeat. It's about persistence in a space that resists change. Because sometimes the real fight isn't in the ring. It's in staying visible long enough that the world has no choice but to make room. Caroline Cossey. Caroline Cossey learned early that survival depended on what you didn't say. In a world quick to punish difference, she found a narrow path through beauty, fashion, and control. Modeling gave her something rare, the ability to be seen without being questioned. For a moment, it worked. She built a career, appeared in a James Bond film, and moved through an industry that accepted her presence as long as it remained unexplained. She wasn't hiding. She was navigating. Then the truth was taken from her. In the early 1980s, tabloids exposed her transgender identity without consent and turned her life into scandal overnight. The narrative wasn't hers anymore. It was rewritten in headlines designed to shock, not understand. Work disappeared instantly. Opportunities vanished. What had been a rising career became a warning to others. Visibility didn't empower her. It hunted her. Privacy wasn't lost. It was stolen. Cossey refused to stay reduced to a headline. She stepped forward not to celebrate exposure, but to correct it. She told her own story, challenged the damage of outing culture, and demanded to be seen as a woman whose privacy had been violated, not surrendered. Her legacy isn't built on fame, it's built on a hard truth. Being seen without consent is not recognition, it is harm. And in a world that profits from exposure, control over your own story becomes the only real form of survival. Candy Darling. Candy Darling didn't just want to be seen, she wanted to belong. In a time when language for identity barely existed, she built herself out of elegance, discipline, and an almost fragile belief that beauty could open doors the world kept closed. Moving through New York's underground scene and Andy Warhol's factory, she refused to be a spectacle. She chased something more dangerous, legitimacy. She studied old Hollywood, dreamed of serious roles, and carried herself like a star long before the industry agreed. For a while, the illusion held. She appeared in films, became a fixture in art and fashion, and drew attention that felt close to acceptance, but never quite reached it. Then came the quiet rupture that changed everything. Candy was diagnosed with lymphoma. As her body weakened, the world did not turn away. Cameras stayed. Interviews continued. Her illness didn't grant her privacy. It made her more visible. Every appearance became documentation, every moment a record of decline that the public consumed without restraint. When she died in 1974 at just 29, the story froze. Tributes came from artists and icons, but they preserved her as myth, not as a woman who had been fighting for an ordinary future. Candy Darling became eternal in image and incomplete in life. Her legacy is not just beauty, it is interruption, a reminder that sometimes the world doesn't reject you outright. It keeps you just long enough to turn you into something unforgettable, then lets you disappear before you can ask for more. James Dean. James Dean never played by the rules because he never believed in them to begin with. In a post-war America obsessed with certainty, he moved in the opposite direction, drawn to contradiction, vulnerability, and emotional truth. Acting wasn't performance for him, it was exposure. On screen, he gave audiences something they weren't used to seeing, a masculinity that was restless, unfinished, and impossible to pin down. Fame came fast, but it never fit. The more the world tried to define him, the more he resisted. Off-screen, that resistance became its own kind of tension. Rumors followed him, questions circled, and expectations grew louder. Hollywood wanted clarity, labels, answers that could be packaged and sold. Dean refused all of it. When asked about his sexuality, he didn't explain. He deflected, not out of fear, but out of refusal. He wasn't interested in narrowing himself to make others comfortable. In an industry where even whispers could destroy a career, ambiguity became both his shield and his risk. Then everything stopped. In 1955, at just 24, James Dean died in a car crash before the world could force a conclusion onto his story. What remained was unfinished, and that became his power. Others tried to define him after he was gone, turning fragments into certainty, myth into narrative. But Dean never gave them the full picture. His legacy isn't an answer. It's a question that still lingers. A reminder that sometimes the only way to stay free is to leave before the world decides who you are. Pete Burns. Pete Burns never asked for permission to exist. From the moment he stepped into public view, he rejected every rule about how a body should look, how a man should act, and how identity should behave. Music made him famous, but it was his image that held the world hostage. With Dead or Alive, he became instantly recognizable not just for the sound, but for a presence that refused definition. He wasn't trying to shock, he was simply refusing to be reduced. As attention grew, control began to slip. Interviews focused less on his music and more on his face, his style, his difference. What he saw as self-expression, the world reframed as spectacle. Over time, that tension turned inward. Cosmetic procedures began as autonomy, a way to shape his own image on his own terms. But the line between control and consequence blurred. Surgeries multiplied. Complications followed. His body became something the public felt entitled to judge, mock, and dissect. Burns never softened the truth to make it easier to consume. He spoke openly about regret without offering apology, refusing to turn himself into a cautionary tale for others. When he died in 2016, much of the conversation still circled his appearance instead of his artistry. But his legacy resists that reduction. Pete Burns stands as a reminder that when the world turns a person into entertainment, survival itself becomes an act of defiance. Not clean, not comfortable, but undeniably real. Hunter Schafer. Hunter Schafer didn't enter the spotlight by accident. She moved toward it carefully, almost quietly, shaped by a world that demanded restraint before it allowed expression. Growing up in North Carolina, she learned early that difference came with consequences, so she observed more than she explained. Drawing became her language, distance became her strategy. Modeling opened the first door, offering visibility without interrogation. It was a controlled kind of presence, one that let her exist without surrendering everything. Then came Euphoria, and with it a different kind of exposure. As Jules Schafer didn't perform identity as spectacle, she embodied contradiction, desire, confusion, and vulnerability without simplifying any of it. Audiences saw something rare. Not a lesson, not a symbol, but a person unfolding in real time. But attention has a way of rewriting intention. Her past as a young activist challenging restrictive laws resurfaced, and suddenly the narrative risked shrinking her into something easier to label, easier to consume. Schafer refused that reduction. She stepped further into authorship co-writing, creating and choosing when to speak and when to stay silent. She did not offer herself as explanation. She did not perform pain for validation. Every appearance became a negotiation between visibility and control, and still she remained. Her legacy is not loud, it is precise. A reminder that being seen does not have to mean being owned, and that sometimes the strongest statement is deciding exactly how much of yourself the world is allowed to touch. Andrea Pajic. Andrea Pajic built a career in the space between definitions. Discovered as a teenager, she entered fashion not as a statement but as a disruption the industry didn't fully understand. She walked both menswear and womenswear runways her image celebrated precisely because it blurred lines others depended on. Designers praised the ambiguity. Audiences were captivated by it. As long as she remained undefined, she was valuable. Mystery became marketable. Silence became protection. But that balance came with a condition. The moment clarity arrived, the system would have to respond. In 2014, Pajic publicly came out as a transgender woman and underwent gender-affirming surgery, framing it not as transformation but as completion. The reaction was immediate and not entirely welcoming. The same industry that had embraced her ambiguity now fixated on explanation. Interviews shifted. Curiosity replaced admiration. Her identity became the story overshadowing the work she had already proven. Pajic didn't retreat. She continued walking major runways, fronting global campaigns, and quietly redefining what permanence looks like in a space obsessed with novelty. She refused to turn her life into spectacle or her identity into performance. Every success forced the industry to confront what it had once avoided. Her legacy is not disruption for attention. It is endurance, a reminder that real change does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles and stays and refuses to leave until the system has no choice but to adapt. Carmen Carrera. Carmen Carrera stepped into the spotlight through a world built on illusion. On RuPaul's Drag Race, she was introduced as performance first identity, second, a striking image shaped for entertainment not understanding. The audience saw confidence, precision, control. What they didn't see was the distance between the character being celebrated and the person behind it. Visibility opened the door, but only on terms that kept her safely contained within a role. As opportunities followed, the limits became impossible to ignore. Fashion and media embraced her look but hesitated at her truth. Language stayed rooted in drag even as her sense of self became clearer, sharper, undeniable. The industry was comfortable with performance, not with reality. Then Carrera made a choice that changed everything. She publicly transitioned and demanded to be recognized not as an act but as a woman. The response was slow, uneven, and often dismissive. Moments that should have affirmed her identity instead reduced it to spectacle. Carrera didn't step back. She pushed forward, building a modeling career, signing with major agencies, and mentoring others navigating the same barriers. Campaigns calling for her inclusion in spaces like Victoria's Secret gained massive support, yet institutional doors barely moved. Still, she refused to wait for permission. Her legacy is not about being accepted, it is about insisting. A reminder that recognition is often delayed not by lack of talent, but by systems that refuse to see beyond what they were built to expect. Christine Jorgensen. Christine Jorgensen never set out to become a symbol. In the early 1950s, she made a quiet decision to live in alignment with herself, traveling to Denmark for gender-affirming treatment with the hope of returning home unnoticed. She wasn't chasing attention, she was seeking normalcy. For a brief moment, that possibility felt real. She spoke calmly, carried herself with dignity, and treated her transition as something personal, not political. Then the world found her. Headlines exploded across the United States, turning her life into front-page sensation. What she had intended as a private correction became public spectacle overnight. Interviews followed, curiosity intensified, and her identity was no longer her own to define. She became a topic, a case, a question people debated rather than a person simply trying to live. Visibility didn't arrive gently. It arrived with force, and it never let go. The cost became undeniable when she tried to build a life beyond the spotlight. In 1959, her application for a marriage license was denied, her relationship collapsing under public scrutiny and legal rejection. What should have been ordinary was turned into evidence in a national argument about legitimacy. Still, Jorgensen endured, standing with composure in a world determined to define her. Her legacy is not rebellion, it is confrontation. A reminder that even when society refuses recognition, identity does not wait for permission to exist. When someone like Christine Jorgensen is forced into the spotlight without consent, is that progress or exploitation? Caitlyn Jenner. Caitlyn Jenner spent decades becoming a symbol before she was ever allowed to be herself. Olympic gold in 1976 didn't just make her famous, it locked her into an image of strength, certainty, and controlled masculinity that the world refused to question. That identity became armor. Success replaced truth. Discipline replaced alignment. For years, she maintained a life that looked complete from the outside while privately carrying a reality that had no space to exist. Then came the moment the world couldn't ignore. In 2015, Jenner publicly came out as a transgender woman in a televised interview that instantly circled the globe. It was framed as bravery, as revelation, as history in real time. But what followed was something far more complicated. Her transition didn't unfold in private, it became public property. Every step, every change, every relationship was examined, debated, and consumed. Support came, but so did judgment, louder and more persistent. Jenner didn't step away from that spotlight. She moved through it, accepting visibility as something permanent rather than chosen. But with that came a constant negotiation between identity and expectation, truth and performance. Her story didn't end in clarity. It expanded into contradiction. Her legacy is not simple progress. It is tension. A reminder that visibility at the highest level can open doors while quietly taking something else away. So ask yourself this: when the whole world is watching your truth unfold, are you finally free, or just living inside a story that no longer belongs to you? Jessica Alves. Jessica Alves didn't enter fame as a person. She entered as a project. Long before she was allowed to define herself, the media had already decided what she would become. Born in Brazil and pushed into the spotlight through British tabloids and reality television, her identity was shaped in front of an audience that consumed transformation as entertainment. Every change was documented, every decision amplified. Her body became something to be modified, displayed, and judged. At first, it looked like control. Cosmetic procedures promised reinvention, belonging, even power. But the deeper she went, the less control she actually had. Surgeons warned her. The public encouraged her. Cameras rewarded escalation. Pain became part of the process, but it was edited into spectacle. Her body was no longer private. It was content. And the more extreme the transformation became, the more the world paid attention without ever asking why. The breaking point didn't come quietly. After years of surgeries and complications, Alves faced serious health consequences that forced a confrontation she could no longer avoid. In 2020, she publicly came out as a transgender woman, revealing that much of her past transformation had been an attempt to perform a version of masculinity that never fit. The truth reframed everything, but it didn't erase the damage. Her story became something else entirely. Not just visibility, but aftermath. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck understood the rules before most people even realized there were rules to play. Born into poverty and shaped by loss early in life, she learned that survival depended on control, not confession. Hollywood didn't reward honesty, it rewarded precision. On screen, she became one of the most powerful actresses of her time, portraying women who were sharp, complex, and impossible to dominate. Off screen, she revealed almost nothing. That wasn't distance, it was design. Rumors followed her anyway. Questions about her relationships, her intimacy, her private life moved quietly through the industry, never fully spoken, but never fully gone. Stanwyck never confirmed, never denied, because either choice came with consequences. To explain was to risk everything. To defend was to invite more scrutiny. So she chose silence not as absence, but as strategy. In a system that demanded access, she gave none. And in doing so, she kept her power intact. Even when roles began to mirror what the world suspected, she held the line. In Walk on the Wild Side, her portrayal carried an unmistakable subtext, one that blurred the boundary between performance and reality. The speculation intensified, but she never broke character in her own life. She outlasted the era that tried to define her, proving that sometimes survival isn't about being seen. It's about choosing what remains hidden. Jazz Jennings. Jazz Jennings didn't grow into visibility. She was placed inside it. From early childhood, her identity was discussed on television, written about in books, and explained to audiences before she had the space to fully understand it herself. What was framed as education quickly became exposure. Cameras followed her milestones, her struggles, her growth. Childhood wasn't private, it was documented, edited, and shared with the world in real time. At first, it looked like support. A loving family, a platform, a voice that reached millions. Jazz became a symbol of clarity in a conversation many people were just beginning to have. But symbols come with weight. As she entered adolescence, that weight grew heavier. Puberty medical decisions and mental health were no longer personal experiences. They became public discussion. Every step forward was analyzed. Every setback remembered. There was no room to disappear, no space to fail quietly. The cost revealed itself slowly. Complications from surgery, struggles with depression, anxiety, and disordered eating unfolded under constant attention. Even rest required explanation. Even silence was questioned. Jazz didn't choose to step into the spotlight, but she learned to survive inside it. Her story isn't just about progress, it's about pressure. About what happens when a child is asked to represent something bigger than themselves before they have the freedom to say no. April Ashley. April Ashley never wanted to be extraordinary. She wanted something far more fragile, an ordinary life. Born in Liverpool at a time when identity had no safe language, she learned early that survival meant silence. She left England for Paris, then traveled further to Morocco for gender-affirming surgery, not for attention but for alignment. When she returned, she moved carefully, building a life in London society as a model and socialite. For a moment, it worked. She wasn't a headline, she was simply living. Then everything was taken from her in a single stroke. In 1961, a newspaper exposed her transgender identity without consent, turning her private life into public spectacle overnight. The world that had quietly accepted her closed just as quickly. Work disappeared. Invitations stopped. What had been stability became isolation. Visibility didn't offer recognition. It erased the very normalcy she had worked so hard to build. The damage didn't end there. When her marriage later collapsed, the legal system stepped in and made it worse. In 1970, a British court ruled her legally male, invalidating her marriage and reducing her identity to a technicality. The decision didn't just affect her, it shaped laws for years, denying recognition to others who followed. Ashley endured, but under a system that refused to see her fully. Her legacy is not just survival, it is exposure of a deeper truth. That sometimes the greatest harm doesn't come from being seen, but from being defined by those who refuse to understand you. Gigi Gorgeous. Gigi Gorgeous didn't step into fame through Hollywood. She grew up inside the internet where nothing disappears and everything is remembered. What started as beauty videos and lifestyle content slowly turned into something much heavier, a living archive of identity in motion. Every version of her remained visible, layered, compared, and replayed. The audience didn't just watch her evolve. They tracked it frame by frame, moment by moment. At first, that openness felt like power. In 2013, when she came out as a transgender woman, she did it with clarity and control, speaking directly to an audience that had grown with her. Support flooded in. Her platform expanded. Unlike traditional media, she owned her narrative, or at least it seemed that way. But as her influence grew, so did the cost. The line between public and private began to disappear. Relationships became content, love became storyline, and when things fell apart, there was no quiet place to land. Heartbreak didn't happen off camera. It unfolded in real time, analyzed, shared, and consumed by millions. Grief became something that needed to be explained, not just felt. Silence created speculation. Absence demanded answers. Gigi didn't lose control overnight. She lost it gradually as access replaced boundaries. And yet she adapted. Not by disappearing, but by learning when to withhold, when to protect, when to take back pieces of herself the world assumed it owned. Her legacy is not just visibility, it is survival in a space that never stops watching. Chaz Bono. Chaz Bono was born into a life already written for him. As the child of Sonny Bono, and Cher fame wasn't something he chose. It was something he inherited. Cameras were always there, shaping how he was seen before he even had the language to understand himself. From the outside, everything looked defined. But internally, there was a quiet dissonance that didn't fade with time. It grew sharpened and refused to be ignored. For years, Bono searched for alignment in pieces. In the 1990s, he came out as a lesbian, a moment that brought temporary clarity, but not resolution. The deeper truth remained just out of reach, affecting his mental health and sense of stability. Living publicly meant every step toward understanding himself became part of a larger narrative others felt entitled to comment on. There was no space to question privately. Every stage of identity was witnessed, interpreted, and often misunderstood. The turning point came in 2009 when Bono began his gender transition and chose to share the process openly. What followed was not quiet support but intense scrutiny. His journey became content, his family's reactions became storyline, and his presence in mainstream media sparked backlash, debate, and resistance. Still, he didn't step away. He kept moving forward, slowly building a life that felt real rather than performed. His legacy isn't dramatic, it's patient. A reminder that sometimes survival is not about winning, it's about continuing even when the world refuses to make it easy. Elliot Page. Elliot Page built a career on control long before he ever had control over his own identity. From a young age, he was recognized for performances that carried restraint, precision, and emotional depth. On screen, everything felt aligned. Off screen, something was always missing. The industry rewarded discipline but quietly enforced a version of self that grew harder to maintain with every role. Success came early, but it came with a cost that wasn't immediately visible. For years, Page lived inside that tension. In 2014, he came out as gay in a powerful public speech, a moment that brought relief but not resolution. The deeper disconnect remained, affecting his mental health and sense of stability. Awareness didn't make things easier, it made silence heavier. Every appearance, every role, every expectation reinforced a version of identity that no longer felt sustainable. The world saw clarity, he felt distance. Then came the moment that changed everything. In December 2020, Page publicly came out as transgender, asking to be known as Elliot. The announcement was direct, calm, and irreversible. Support arrived, but so did scrutiny. His body, his past roles, his future became subjects of constant discussion. But unlike before, Page didn't retreat. He continued working, speaking carefully, and refusing to disappear. He didn't reintroduce himself for approval. He simply remained. His legacy is not transformation. It is presence. So here's the question. When you finally tell the truth after years of silence, does the world truly see you, or does it just start watching you more closely than ever before? Patricio Manuel. Patricio Manuel didn't walk into boxing to make history. He walked in because it was the only place where effort spoke louder than explanation. Long before the world had language for who he was, Manuel was already fighting quietly inside gyms that measured worth in sweat, not identity. He trained in silence, transitioned in private, and built his body with discipline while the world looked the other way. For a while, that invisibility protected him. He wasn't a headline, he was just a fighter. Then came the moment everything changed. In 2018, Patricio Manuel stepped into the ring as the first openly transgender man to compete professionally in the United States. The victory should have been simple. It wasn't. Instead of celebration, there was hesitation. Opponents pulled out. Promoters stalled. What should have been a career became a question people argued over. His existence turned into a debate about legitimacy, fairness, and boundaries no one had bothered to define before he arrived. Manuel kept showing up anyway, even when fights disappeared, even when losses were magnified and wins were minimized. He refused to disappear just because the system didn't know where to place him. His story isn't about triumph or defeat. It's about persistence in a space that resists change. Because sometimes the real fight isn't in the ring. It's in staying visible long enough that the world has no choice but to make room.